On the morning of June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron gathered his squadron in the ready room aboard the USS Hornet. His 15 torpedo bombers carried obsolete weapons, flew at speeds that made them easy targets, and faced an enemy fleet protected by the most maneuverable fighters in the Pacific. Waldron knew the mathematics of what they were about to attempt. He also knew something his superiors had forgotten during 2 decades of budget cuts and isolationist politics. The industrial base that would replace his aircraft, train new crews, and build the fleet that would eventually crush Japan was already awakening. American factories would produce more combat aircraft in 1944 alone than Japan would build during the entire war. But on that June morning 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Waldron's squadron represented the American arsenal. They flew planes designed in 1935, armed with torpedoes that frequently failed to detonate, and faced Japanese carriers that had seemed invincible since their attack on Hawaii. Before takeoff, Waldron told his men that if only one plane survived, that pilot should press his attack to completion. Every man in Torpedo Squadron 8 followed that order. Not one turned away before delivering ordnance or being shot down. Only 3 of 99 torpedo bomber crew members survived the battle. But something unexpected was already happening in factories across America. Something Japanese military planners had calculated incorrectly. Something that would determine the outcome of the Pacific War more decisively than any naval engagement. The Battle of Midway revealed that industrial capacity was merely mathematics. American shipyards in 1941 launched more merchant vessels than Japan produced during the entire war. In the 3 years following Midway, the Japanese built 6 aircraft carriers. The United States built 141. Japanese planners understood these numbers before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Internal Imperial Navy studies conducted in 1941 showed exactly the production disparity between the 2 nations. The United States produced 11 times as much coal as Japan, 222 times as much oil, 13 times as much steel. American factories were manufacturing 40 times more machine guns, 7 times more bombs, 5 times more artillery pieces. These figures were not secrets. They were readily available facts that any competent intelligence service could obtain. Yet Japan attacked Pearl Harbor anyway. The attack was not the result of ignorance about American industrial capacity. It was the result of a calculated gamble based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how democracies respond to direct assault. Japanese military leadership believed that the United States lacked the cultural will to sustain a prolonged industrial war. They assumed that Americans, still recovering from the Great Depression with 10 million unemployed workers in 1939, would view continued warfare as economically unbearable. They calculated that destroying the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor would force negotiations before American industry could fully mobilize. The Depression had created what economists called capacity slack in the American economy. Industrial facilities operated far below their potential output. Unemployed workers who possessed manufacturing skills waited for jobs that no longer existed. To outside observers, particularly militaristic cultures like Japan's, this slack appeared to be weakness. American newspaper editorials debated isolationism while European cities burned. Political leaders promised voters that their sons would not fight in foreign wars. Congress restricted military spending while Japan conquered Manchuria and Germany annexed Austria. Japanese successes against larger opponents reinforced their confidence. They had defeated Russia in 1905, a startling victory that shocked European military establishments. They had occupied Manchuria in 1931 and launched a full-scale invasion of China in 1937. These campaigns demonstrated that Japan could project military power across vast distances and sustain multi-year operations despite limited resources. Japanese military spending reached 28% of national income by 1937, creating an economy that appeared to be superheating while America's industrial capacity rusted in idleness. What Japanese planners failed to grasp was the difference between capacity utilization and total productive capability. An idle factory is not a destroyed factory. An unemployed worker is not an untrained worker. The slack that appeared to represent American weakness actually represented latent power that could be activated rapidly once political will emerged. But that understanding required appreciating factors that Japanese military culture systematically undervalued. The Japanese military faced a critical strategic problem in 1941 that admitted no satisfactory solution. Japan imported 90% of its oil, with the majority coming from the United States and territories controlled by nations now fighting Germany. The Japanese Navy had stockpiled approximately 42.7 million barrels by March 1941, primarily from California and the Dutch East Indies. That reserve provided perhaps 18 months of operations at wartime consumption rates. Naval task forces alone consumed 6,000 barrels daily during normal operations, more during combat. When the United States imposed a complete oil embargo in July 1941 after Japan occupied southern French Indochina, Japanese planners faced a countdown. Either negotiate a settlement that would require withdrawing from China and abandoning territorial ambitions across Southeast Asia, or seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies before stockpiles were exhausted. The only obstacle to that seizure was the American Pacific Fleet based at Pearl Harbor. Japanese strategic planning assumed that crippling the Pacific Fleet would provide the 18 to 24 months needed to secure resource-rich territories and establish a defensive perimeter that American forces could not penetrate before a negotiated peace became preferable to sustained warfare. This calculation depended on several assumptions about American industrial mobilization. Japanese planners assumed that democratic nations required extended periods to convert civilian industry to military production. They assumed that labor unions would resist the wage controls and extended work hours necessary for war production. They assumed that a population enjoying consumer goods would reject the rationing and sacrifice that total war demanded. They assumed that regional political divisions between isolationists and interventionists would paralyze decision-making. Every assumption was wrong. The attack on Pearl Harbor unified American public opinion with a completeness that no political leader had achieved through persuasion. Regional divisions evaporated. Isolationist senators voted for war declarations. Labor unions signed no-strike pledges. Factories that had produced automobiles retooled to manufacture aircraft with a speed that stunned outside observers. The sleeping giant that Japan feared awakening was not merely industrial capacity. It was the transformation of slack resources into focused production through collective anger at unprovoked assault. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who planned the Pearl Harbor attack, understood what his government risked. His documented statements before the war expressed deep skepticism about Japan's chances in extended conflict. He told colleagues that Japan might run wild for 6 months or perhaps a year, but after that he had no expectation of success. That prediction proved remarkably accurate. The Battle of Midway occurred almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, marking the point where American production began overwhelming Japanese capacity to replace losses. Yamamoto's private doubts never translated into effective opposition to war plans. Japanese military culture treated cautious analysis as defeatism. Officers who questioned operational planning faced accusations of insufficient fighting spirit. The Army and Navy operated as competing institutions that refused to coordinate strategy. This institutional structure meant that even when individual officers understood the industrial disparity with America, their concerns could not influence national policy. The decision for war emerged from political dynamics that made withdrawal from China unacceptable regardless of strategic consequences. Japanese leadership recognized one important fact. Germany's declaration of war on the United States following Pearl Harbor was not guaranteed. Japan began the Pacific conflict facing the possibility that the entire American industrial base might focus exclusively on the Pacific theater. Even with most American resources eventually directed toward Europe under the Germany First strategy, Japan still confronted production capacity that exceeded their own by overwhelming margins. With American attention divided between two theaters, the disparity would have been even more catastrophic. President Franklin Roosevelt announced production goals in May 1940 that Adolf Hitler's advisors dismissed as propaganda. Roosevelt called for 185,000 aircraft, 120,000 tanks, 55,000 anti-aircraft guns, and 18 million tons of merchant shipping within 2 years. German intelligence reported these numbers as impossible exaggerations. In 1939, annual American military aircraft production was fewer than 3,000 planes. How could a nation increase output sixtyfold in such a short period? The answer involved factors that foreign military planners consistently underestimated. American industry possessed something more valuable than current production capacity. It possessed experience with mass production techniques developed in automobile manufacturing. Henry Ford had pioneered assembly line methods that could produce extraordinarily complex machines through standardized components and specialized labor. The Ford Motor Company in Michigan built complete automobiles comprising 15,000 parts every 6 to 9 seconds at peak production. That organizational knowledge transferred directly to aircraft and tank production once political will emerged to fund the conversion. The Depression had created a reservoir of skilled workers who understood factory operations. They knew how to operate lathes and milling machines. They understood welding and assembly procedures. They could read technical drawings and maintain quality control. These workers did not need to be trained from scratch. They needed employment. When factories reopened under military contracts, experienced workers returned to assembly lines they already understood. Training programs converted civilian workers to military production roles in weeks rather than months. The automotive industry provided immediate organizational capacity. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler operated some of the largest integrated manufacturing facilities in the world. These corporations understood supply chain management, subcontractor coordination, and large-scale logistics. When the government directed them to produce tanks and aircraft instead of automobiles, they applied existing management systems to new products. Chrysler's Detroit Arsenal tank plant, designed by architect Albert Kahn and completed in 1941, used the same organizational principles that had made automobile production efficient. Tank manufacturing required different tools and different components, but the fundamental industrial process remained consistent with automobile assembly. Standardization became the foundation of American wartime production. Military planners designed weapons that could be manufactured using existing machine tools and existing worker skills. The M4 Sherman tank used components that automotive factories could produce without extensive retooling. The Liberty ship, while new in design, used welding techniques and assembly methods that reduced construction time from 8 months to an average of 42 days by late 1943. At peak efficiency in Kaiser's shipyards, Liberty ships required only 39 days from keel laying to launch. One vessel, the SS Robert E. Perry, was constructed in 4 days and 15 hours as a demonstration of what concentrated effort could achieve. Aircraft production required more sophisticated facilities than shipbuilding, but the principles remained similar. Factories designed specifically for aircraft assembly used wide, open floor plans that allowed material to flow through production stages without interruption. Workers entered these facilities from below ground, climbing stairs to their workstations, which minimized disruption to material movement on the factory floor. Architect Albert Kahn designed nearly 100 million square feet of factory space during the war, applying lessons learned from automotive production to military manufacturing. The Willow Run bomber plant, constructed for Ford to produce B-24 Liberator bombers, featured an assembly line over a mile long. The facility employed 42,000 workers at its peak, operating continuously with multiple shifts. Each worker performed specialized tasks that required days or weeks of training rather than months. This specialization meant that factories could absorb new workers rapidly. A complete novice could be trained as a productive welder in little more than a week. More complex tasks required longer training periods, but the assembly line divided aircraft construction into discrete operations that individuals could master quickly. Japan's aircraft industry followed different organizational principles. Production occurred in smaller facilities with highly skilled craftsmen who performed multiple operations. This approach produced excellent aircraft, particularly the Mitsubishi A6M0, which combined exceptional range and maneuverability. But it did not scale efficiently. Japanese monthly airframe production grew from 306 in January 1939 to 2,541 in May 1944. This represented an 8-fold increase over 5 years. American production grew from fewer than 3,000 military aircraft in 1939 to 300,000 by war's end, a 100-fold increase in 6 years. The disparity reflected fundamental differences in industrial organization. Japanese manufacturers depended on supplier networks that extended across the home islands and occupied territories. When American submarines began sinking merchant shipping in 1943, these supply networks collapsed. Coal shipments that fed industrial furnaces decreased dramatically. Iron ore from Manchuria arrived irregularly. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, even after Japan captured the fields, could not reach Japanese refineries in sufficient quantities. Strategic bombing by American B-29s, beginning in earnest in 1944, destroyed factories, transportation infrastructure, and power generation facilities. American industry faced no comparable vulnerabilities. Raw materials arrived from sources protected by geography and naval power. Steel production facilities in Pennsylvania operated without fear of bombing. Oil fields in Texas pumped continuously. Aluminum refineries in Tennessee processed or without disruption. The two ocean barriers that Japanese planners had viewed as protecting their home islands instead protected American production from any serious threat of disruption. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Rosie the Riveter became a cultural icon representing millions of women who learned factory work, operated machine tools, and assembled aircraft. By 1943, women comprised approximately one-third of the workforce in aircraft plants. This expansion of available labor was something Japanese planners had not anticipated. Cultural assumptions about gender roles prevented them from imagining how rapidly women could master industrial work when necessity demanded it. The magnitude of American production becomes clear through specific comparisons. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards produced 141 aircraft carriers compared to Japan's 16. The United States built 56 battleships and cruisers compared to Japan's 11. American factories manufactured 349 destroyers while Japan managed 63. Submarine construction reached 203 American vessels against 167 Japanese. Merchant shipping revealed the most dramatic disparity. American yards produced 33.993 million tons of merchant vessels compared to Japan's 4.152 million tons. The United States launched more vessels in 1941 alone than Japan did during the entire war. Shipyards turned out tonnage so rapidly that by autumn 1943, all Allied shipping sunk since 1939 had been replaced. This meant that German U-boats and Japanese submarines, despite sinking millions of tons of Allied shipping, were fighting a losing battle against American shipbuilding capacity. Every merchant vessel sunk was replaced by 2 or 3 new vessels within months. Aircraft production told the same story. American factories manufactured 297,000 aircraft during the war compared to Japan's 76,000. Tank production reached 86,000 American vehicles. Artillery pieces numbered 193,000. The United States produced 2 million army trucks, vehicles that provided the logistical backbone for operations across multiple continents. These were not just numbers on production reports. Each represented a functioning weapon system, delivered to combat units, maintained by trained personnel, supplied with ammunition and spare parts through logistics networks that stretched around the world. American industrial production doubled between 1942 and 1945 despite starting from the world's largest industrial base. In 4 years, more than half of all industrial production on Earth occurred in the United States. By 1944, while other combatant nations were approaching the limits of their productive capacity, American output continued growing. Germany and Japan faced destroyed factories, severed supply lines, and exhausted labor forces. Britain and the Soviet Union were maximizing every available resource. Only the United States possessed excess capacity that could be activated if needed. This economic reality manifested in naval battles where outcomes seemed predetermined by industrial mathematics rather than tactical skill. At the Battle of Midway, American carriers could afford losses that would have been catastrophic for Japan. When the USS Yorktown was torpedoed and eventually sunk, American shipyards were already building replacements at rates Japan could not match. The 4 Japanese carriers sunk at Midway, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, represented nearly half of Japan's large carrier fleet. Those vessels had participated in the Pearl Harbor attacks 6 months earlier. Their destruction eliminated irreplaceable assets. More critically, Midway cost Japan approximately 100 trained carrier pilots and over 40% of carrier maintenance crews, flight deck personnel, and aviation mechanics. These specialists represented years of training and operational experience. Japan had approximately 2,000 carrier-qualified aircrew at the war's start. Losing 100 in a single battle was sustainable. But sustained attrition throughout 1942 and 1943, combined with an inability to train replacements at American rates, meant that even when Japan built new carriers, they lacked the experienced crews to operate them effectively. American pilot training programs scaled with industrial production. Flight schools expanded to train thousands of pilots monthly. Experienced combat veterans rotated back to training commands to pass tactical knowledge to new pilots. Aircraft used for training could be replaced rapidly from the production stream. Japan's training system could not compete. Fuel shortages restricted training hours. Aircraft assigned to training units could not be replaced if damaged. By 1944, Japanese pilots were entering combat with minimal flying experience, while American pilots had logged hundreds of training hours in aircraft types they would actually fly in battle. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated how industrial capacity translated into combat effectiveness. American carrier forces launched attacks from ranges that Japanese aircraft could not match. American fighters, including the new F-6F Hellcat specifically designed to counter the Zero, shot down Japanese aircraft at ratios exceeding 10-1. Japanese pilots called the engagement the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American losses were minimal and immediately replaced. Japanese losses were catastrophic and irreplaceable. The Imperial Japanese Navy lost 3 carriers and approximately 600 aircraft along with most of their trained pilots. After this battle, Japan could no longer conduct offensive carrier operations. The submarine campaign demonstrated another dimension of industrial disparity. American submarines operated with sophisticated torpedo systems, reliable diesel engines, and advanced radar equipment. When torpedoes proved defective in early 1942, American factories redesigned and produced improved models. Japanese submarines focused on attacking warships rather than merchant shipping, a strategic decision that reflected cultural preferences for decisive fleet engagements over economic warfare. American submarines systematically destroyed Japanese merchant shipping, sinking approximately 5 million tons by war's end. This submarine campaign had cascading effects on Japanese industrial capacity. Without merchant vessels, raw materials from Southeast Asia could not reach home islands. Without iron ore, steel production decreased. Without steel, shipyards could not build replacement vessels. Without oil, remaining merchant ships could not sail. The cycle became self-reinforcing. By 1945, Japanese merchant shipping had decreased to approximately 10% of 1941 levels. The entire economic system that Japanese planners had constructed through territorial conquest collapsed because they could not protect maritime supply lines against American submarines produced faster than they could be sunk. American logistics networks represented another industrial achievement that Japanese planners had failed to anticipate. Supplying combat forces across thousands of miles of ocean required more than producing weapons. It required producing the mundane items that sustain military operations. Ammunition in thousands of calibers and types. Spare parts for hundreds of vehicle and aircraft models. Petroleum products in multiple grades for different engines. Medical supplies. Food, clothing, tools, communications equipment. Every item needed to be manufactured, packaged, shipped, stored, and distributed to units that might be operating on remote Pacific islands thousands of miles from the nearest supply depot. The United States developed mobile logistics bases that advanced with combat forces. Ships designed specifically for replenishment operations could transfer fuel, ammunition, and supplies to combat vessels at sea, eliminating the need for time-consuming returns to port facilities. These fleet trains allowed American carrier task forces to operate continuously for weeks at distances where Japanese forces needed to return to base for resupply. This logistical capability, built on industrial production of specialized vessels and systematic organization of supply chains, provided strategic advantages that Japanese forces could not counter through tactical skill. Production statistics reveal only part of the story. Quality control systems ensured that weapons functioned reliably under combat conditions. Testing protocols identified defects before equipment reached frontline units. When problems emerged in the field, feedback mechanisms allowed rapid redesign and production of improved models. The proximity fuse, developed through collaboration between civilian scientists and military engineers, proved 5 times more effective than conventional artillery fuses. General George Patton credited it with winning the Battle of the Bulge. This technology emerged from research programs funded by an industrial base that could afford to invest in experimental developments while simultaneously producing conventional weapons at unprecedented volumes. Japanese industry lacked comparable resources for research and development. With factories struggling to meet immediate production quotas under conditions of material shortage and labor exhaustion, experimental programs represented luxury investments that could not be justified. Japanese aircraft designs that dominated in 1941 became obsolete by 1943, but replacing them required development time and resources that were no longer available. The Zero fighter remained Japan's primary carrier aircraft throughout the war despite being surpassed by American designs. This technological stagnation reflected industrial constraints rather than engineering limitations. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan demonstrated what unconstrained industrial production could achieve when applied to a nation whose defenses had degraded through attrition. By 1945, American B-29 bombers operated with near impunity over Japanese cities. These aircraft represented technological achievements that required enormous industrial resources. Each B-29 cost approximately $640,000, contained 55,000 different parts, and required approximately 200,000 engineering man-hours to design. American factories built over 3,000 of them. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9 through 10, 1945, killed approximately 80,000 civilians. Subsequent raids destroyed major industrial centers across Japan. American production capacity meant that losses in aircraft or crews did not diminish operational tempo. Damaged aircraft could be replaced. Lost crews could be replaced. The Japanese had no effective counter. Their fighter aircraft lacked the altitude capability to intercept B-29s operating at maximum height. Fuel shortages grounded most defensive aircraft. Anti-aircraft ammunition was rationed. The home islands were essentially defenseless against an opponent whose industrial capacity allowed sustained aerial assault regardless of losses incurred. Japanese miscalculations about American industrial capacity were not failures of intelligence. They were failures of imagination. Japanese planners understood the raw numbers. They knew America produced more steel, more oil, more of every resource that modern warfare consumed. What they failed to grasp was how rapidly American industry could convert peaceful production to military manufacturing once political will emerged. They miscalculated American cultural response to direct assault. They assumed that a diverse democracy would fragment under pressure when instead it unified with frightening efficiency. The Pearl Harbor attack was meant to provide Japan with 18 to 24 months to consolidate territorial gains before American production reached overwhelming levels. Instead, it provided the political catalyst that transformed American industrial potential into actual production within months. By summer 1942, American factories were already producing at rates that exceeded Japanese capacity. By 1943, American production exceeded the combined output of all Axis powers. By 1944, the disparity had become so extreme that Japanese planners recognized the war was unwinnable, but cultural factors prevented them from acknowledging defeat. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 provided justification for surrender that Japanese leadership could accept without admitting that conventional military defeat was inevitable. But Japan's economic collapse preceded those atomic attacks. By summer 1945, Japanese industrial production had essentially ceased. Transportation networks were destroyed. Factories lacked power. Workers were starving. The strategic question was not whether Japan would be defeated, but how many casualties would occur before surrender became politically possible. Admiral Yamamoto died in April 1943 when American fighters, directed by intelligence that had broken Japanese codes, intercepted his transport aircraft over Bougainville. His death was a significant psychological blow to Japanese forces. But his earlier prediction had already proven accurate. Japan ran wild for approximately 6 months after Pearl Harbor. After Midway, the strategic initiative shifted permanently to American forces. After that turning point, Japanese strategy focused on inflicting sufficient casualties to make continued American offensive operations politically unbearable. This strategy required American resolve to collapse when confronted with mounting losses. The strategy failed because it misunderstood how industrial capacity shapes national will. Americans recognized that industrial production meant losses could be replaced. Sunk ships would be replaced by ships already under construction. Lost aircraft would be replaced by aircraft rolling off assembly lines. Casualties could be tragic without being strategically decisive because the industrial base ensured that military capability would continue growing regardless of battlefield losses. Japanese strategy assumed that American casualties would erode public support for continued warfare. Instead, industrial production convinced Americans that victory was inevitable if they sustained the effort required. Lieutenant Commander Waldron's torpedo squadron was annihilated at Midway, but the factories that built their aircraft were already producing replacements. The carriers from which they launched were being supplemented by new carriers under construction in shipyards that worked continuously. The crews who flew those obsolete torpedo bombers were being replaced by pilots training in aircraft specifically designed to counter Japanese fighters. Waldron's sacrifice bought time for American industrial capacity to translate into combat power that Japanese forces could not match. By war's end, the disparity between American and Japanese industrial production had become almost incomprehensible. The United States produced more than its own military forces required and supplied allies across multiple continents. Lend-Lease delivered over $48 billion worth of equipment to Britain and the Soviet Union. This meant American industry was simultaneously arming its own forces, replacing combat losses, developing new weapons systems, and providing equipment to allies, all while maintaining civilian production that exceeded pre-war levels. American consumer spending actually increased during the war, unique among all combatant nations. Japanese industry could not feed its own population by 1945. 3 million Japanese died from war-related causes, with significant percentages from starvation and disease resulting from economic collapse. 25% of national wealth was destroyed. 80% of merchant shipping was sunk. 35% of industrial machinery was damaged beyond repair. These statistics reflected not just military defeat but complete industrial failure. The lesson Japanese planners learned too late was that industrial capacity cannot be calculated merely by counting existing factories and current production. It must account for organizational capability, labor availability, resource access, and cultural factors that determine how rapidly production can scale. Japan's calculation that America lacked the will to fight a prolonged industrial war was the most catastrophic strategic miscalculation of the Pacific conflict. That miscalculation cost millions of lives and resulted in unconditional surrender that erased Japanese territorial ambitions for generations. American industry in World War II demonstrated what a democracy can achieve when political will aligns with industrial capability. The transformation from Depression-era economic stagnation to the arsenal of democracy occurred within 3 years. That transformation validated every prediction Yamamoto had made about American productive capacity overwhelming Japanese resources if war continued past the initial 6 months. The sleeping giant awakened exactly as Japanese planners feared. What they failed to anticipate was how quickly it would awaken and how completely its industrial power would dominate the Pacific theater once fully mobilized. The question was never whether America could produce enough to win. The question was whether political will would emerge to activate that production. Pearl Harbor answered that question. Everything that followed was mathematics. And in industrial warfare, Japan's mathematics never added up to anything but eventual defeat once American factories fully engaged. If this exploration of how industrial capacity shaped the Pacific War resonates with you, consider how often we underestimate what seemingly peaceful nations can accomplish when threatened directly. The transformation from economic depression to the world's dominant industrial power occurred within a single presidential term. That transformation changed global power structures for the remainder of the 20th century and established patterns of American military dominance that persist today. Understanding how Japan misjudged American industrial response helps explain why modern military planning focuses so heavily on economic factors. Wars are won not just on battlefields but in factories, shipyards, and logistics networks that sustain combat operations across months and years. The side that can replace losses faster than they occur will eventually win regardless of initial tactical setbacks. This lesson, learned at terrible cost across the Pacific, shaped every major military conflict that followed World War II.